Odd giving a seminar to a computer, but I'll try. And yeah, I'm George David Smith, director of the MRC Integrative Epidemiology Unit. Great thing, and I'm just going to talk about what the title is: Birth of Clinical Trials in Late 19th Century India. I guess the advantages of talking to a computer is you don't notice people falling asleep, and everyone you can turn me off. So that's you're in a much better position than I can't turn myself off. I have to listen to myself. Anyway, so yeah, so pardon, I can't change the slides. That's excellent. Yeah, okay. So in the standard history of the introduction of clinical trials, the Danish Nobel laureate Johannes Fibiger is generally said to be the first person who carried out a trial with alternate allocation of treatment. So the notion here is that if the doctor treats every second patient with the experimental treatment and actually sticks assiduously to that, doesn't allow any form of anything to come in to actually disturb that form of allocation, then there should be, this should produce comparable groups. And Fibiger carried out such a study with anti-diphtheria serum in 1898. And as I say, this is generally thought to be, or was often put down to be, the first such study. So here's Fibiger. Here's a photo of Fibiger. He said, here's just a quote, I won't read them all out all the way through, but he says how what he was attempting to do was eliminate the play of chance and the influence of subjective judgment, and the rational one to do that was to treat every other patient with serum and every other patient in the usual way. In fact, in that study, he actually did alternate days. It wasn't alternate patients, it was alternate days in which treatments, the active treatment, the serum therapy, was given to the diphtheria patients. And Fibiger received the Nobel Prize, but he didn't receive it. He received it in 1927 because in the actual 1926 they decided neither of the two candidates was good enough, but then they relented and gave it to Fibiger in 1927 after it wasn't jointly awarded to him and a Japanese scientist in 1926. And he was awarded the Nobel Prize for identifying a type of roundworm as a cause of the cancer, which of course turned out to be spurious. So he got his Nobel Prize for that, not for alternate allocation or fair test of medical therapy. The work of his rival never received the Nobel Prize. It turned out to be not spurious and important. Now, on the James Lind Library, which many of you will know, but if you don't, you should get to know it. It's a fantastic resource of the history of attempts at getting fair assessments of treatment in medicine. And there's this has gone back assiduously and located evidence or has located studies which attempted to get fair evidence. And among those, there are ones before the ones I'll talk about today, which did do appeared to do some form of alternation. Well known is Thomas Graham Balfour, probably best known as Balfour, who was using belladonna treatment, and he said that he took alternately he took patients who were boys to be given the therapy, active therapy. And there was a surgical study of stricture of the urethra in which Berkeley Hill stated that he tied in a catheter in every alternate case in a series of 38 urethrotomies and just left the alternate ones without the catheter to evaluate the effects of this in his treatment. So there were some studies that went before. But this is this was a survey of various journals, including the Indian Medical Gazette, because it turned out that they published many of these for reasons that we'll get onto. That such alternate trials sort of took off towards the end of the 19th and beginning of the 20th century. And the large majority of them were in the face of infectious disease, particular plague. And people writing at the time were sort of reviewing this history, and W.H. Park, who himself went on to claim that he'd carried out a study of an alternate allocation trial before Fibiger of diphtheria serum, which it's probably untrue. He hadn't probably done this. And Scott Podolsky and I wrote a piece about Park. But these alternate allocation studies were well known. And the ones which became best known were ones that were instigated with respect to the outbreak of plague in Bombay, as it was then called, in 1896. This was a large and important epidemic which had dramatic health and social consequences. The management practices put in by the British ruling imperial authorities at the time led to very severe reaction in the population. One of the main plague hospitals, the Arthur Road Hospital, for example, was attacked and set fire to during riots. During the plague, patients were forced into quarantine, and places where the quarantine was apparently happening were attacked to free them. There was riots on trains which were trying to move people into quarantine, etc. There's very serious civil rebellions occurred in response to the approaches that were trying to be used to manage the spread of plague. And it was against this background that these alternate allocation trials were carried out, which I think makes them rather remarkable. Here's a justice of the peace with a search party in Bombay in 1896 or 97, forcing the search parties into people's houses to try and find people who were thought to be potentially infected, who were being squirreled away by their families. And during one of the attacks on the hospitals, here's the hospital nurses escaping from the rioters. There's a brilliant, there's actually now a pair of novels by joint authors who call themselves Kalpesh Ratna when they write novels together. They're both doctors. They've wrote this novel, The Quarantine Papers, with a nice cover from Bruegel's Triumph of Death, and more recently Room 000. So there's some good fictional and historical fictional coverage of that period. Now, the outbreak of plague, the occurrence of plague in Bombay, as usually was often the case with such epidemics, particularly excited those outside of India for whom it was thought that this might be something which might spread elsewhere. And several plague commissions, the British Indian Plague Commission, and there was a Russian Plague Commission, there was a French Plague Commission, of which Yersin and the Pasteur Labs went as a commissioner, and the Plague Commission visited many times over that period, over this period, and was one of the places where much of the reporting of what was actually happening in terms of attempts at vaccinations, attempts at medical therapies, where it all appeared. as the BMJ said of one of the first reports, it was a blue book of a size sufficient to glut the appetite of the most ardent student of such literature. And with the first visit of the Play Commission, probably the sort of intellectual centre of it would have been Almroth Wright, who was at that stage probably the leading medical researcher, someone who was a medical researcher and a medical practitioner, a person of very strong opinions, known by some people who disagreed with him as would call him either almost right or Almroth wrong, with the two names applied to him, but certainly someone who was not did not tend to credit others with ideas, and at that time he was hugely opposed to any form of treatment which wasn't based on the sort of clinician's knowledge, even though he later went on to actually do alternate allocation studies 25 years after everyone else. But Wright was an important member of that commission, and here's from one of the BMJ papers that sort of summarise these thick blue books, and these blue books are now available. You can get them available scanned in. I have all 4 volumes photocopied, tragically. But in the BMJ report, they say about how they lay the chief stress upon the fallacies resulting from an improper selection of control cases. Lengthy and laboured criticisms of this matter are uninteresting. It's quite obvious that some of the statistics above quoted are unconvincing. The only important point the commissioners bring out is that the one indisputable guarantee of the efficacy of a serum is its success when applied on the alternate method, every personal factor in the selection of cases being rigidly excluded. So that's not saying, you know, the statisticians are going on and on and on. It's all pretty boring, except for the fact that it's pretty obvious that you want, if you want to have a fair comparison, you alternate, which was that seemed to be the approach to do that. And Carl Pearson, in a sort of famous paper, now famous paper in the British Medical Journal in 1904, where he carried out what we'd now call a meta-analysis of non-controlled studies of typhoid inoculation. And he concluded in this that there wasn't actually that great evidence for the beneficial effects of typhoid inoculation, although in fact that he did demonstrate some benefit. Here he was in argument with Almroth Wright, who was an advocate of and one of the instigators, developers of typhoid vaccine. And Pearson and Wright, following this Pearson's paper, there was exchanges, letters in the BMJ for weeks or months after, and in those days you were allowed to be really quite rude about the person you're writing about, so they're much more entertaining than the ones today. But Pearson said, well, what we should do is inoculate every second volunteer. So it was advocated for randomized, was not randomized, was advocated for this alternate allocation study, which would allow a fair comparison of whether the typhoid vaccine was a bit beneficial or not. So in 1900, N.H. Choksey, who was probably then the sort of leading clinician in Bombay, wrote into the Lancet following a piece in the Lancet by their anonymous special correspondent in India, which was very critical of this, of trying to treat the plague with serum therapy. So you've got to remember that this is where serum therapy for diphtheria had sort of recently been developed and was considered by some to be useful, and but was by then beginning to take off, and to sort of where the general opinion was that it was beneficial. So it would be antibodies generated in horses often, but other animals were the source of some attempts to manage to get such antitoxin serums, which were then given to treat people with infection. So this was a treatment. So this wasn't given. It wasn't vaccination or immunisation. It was used as active treatment of active infection. So in this letter, Choksi reported on his first 1,000 cases where he had alternately treated half the patients, every second patient, without any attempt at exclusion of any sort. And you've got to remember, this was being done, the hospital was being sort of attacked by rioters as he was in the Arthur Road Hospital during this, while this study was being carried out. And here was the data that he put in the letter, suggesting that that the treatment was reducing, not drastically, but did appear to be associated with lower mortality. The mortality still being very high at 68 versus 80%. Choksi, in the letter, says that he says about that, this does seem to suggest benefit, that with diphtheria antitoxin it took more than a decade its perfection, and there's not been that time for the develop the best agent in the treatment of plague, but that this was at least looked promising. And he carried out some sort of exclusions, so he didn't stick strictly to the intention to treat analysis, as it were. So he did report some analyses with exclusions. And here he is, as I say, probably the leading one of the leading doctors in India, undoubtedly, at the time. And looking into the correspondence at that time, all of which is in archives, it became clear that when I was looking at this, that Choksi wasn't entirely happy with alternation. And James S. Wilkins, who was a special medical officer in the Bombay province, part of the Indian Medical Service, so the British Imperialist Medical Service in that part of India, he was sending them correspondence was being sent upwards to his bosses regarding the plague situation, which was the most pressing political problem that there was in India at that time. And so Wilkins says that he'd asked Dr. Choksi to use the serum at the Arthur Road Hospital on the same plan as that adopted by Rue's serum at the Midakana, etc., and using every second patient who comes in to get active treatment, and the first as a control. So this alternate allocation. And elsewhere, Wilkins talked about how this had been used in diphtheria, so did already know about Fibberger's study, even though Fibberger's study didn't actually get that incredibly well known. And he's saying, in accordance with a wish expressed to me, Dr. Choksi did this. He undertook to carry out the plan. He kindly undertook to carry out the plan. And his letter with number 625 is here with appended. And what happened is we get every week. It's rather like us nowadays, now being Tuesday, of course, at about 10 this morning, they released the weekly mortality data up to the 27th of March. So it's rather like looking at the weekly mortality data, but here he was getting data that from this alternate allocation study. Also in the letters, it was clear that Choksi wasn't entirely happy with this. He said, "I fully expressed my views on the method of investigating the serum treatment by treating every alternate case in my my report for April last year. And here he was saying that, that some patients who were just like beyond any hope of recovery, why alternate? Why include them? And then, some other, patients might be doing so well that you might think they had very little chance of, very little probability of dying, and that you should actually, at the very least, you should sort of choose, choose the group of patients to evaluate treatment in. But he was basically told, as he says here, in deference to the wishes of Lieutenant Colonel J.S. Wilkins, Special Medical Officer, a series of observations was conducted last month. So this was sort of ordered upon him. And whilst Troxy was definitely the best known person doctor carrying out these studies, a large number of them were going on. And here's a table from a 1905 report by Lieutenant Colonel William Bannerman, where he details all the studies that he knew of, where there was alternate allocation. And you hear what you see is that there's lots of different serums. So there was a lot of argument about what was the best way to produce this serum. Yurtsin was from the Pasteur Institute. There was the Roux, and as was Roux, so there was the Roux-Yurtsin serum, and then there was the Lustig's serum and Brazil's serum, etc. So there are these different serums. And what's at the bottom, you see at the bottom, total treated with Brazil's serum, total treated with Lustig's serum, is that a sort of meta-analysis is done. Otherwise, it's adding them up, but pooled analysis was being carried out. And overall there was rather little, when putting all of these together, there was rather little. The evidence for benefit was not that strong or that large. And here's Dr. Simons injecting it's referred to as the curative plague serum, but didn't turn out to be that curative. And all the different plague commissions were really wanted to get in on the act, and the Russian Plague Commission, it carried out a small study, and the French Plague Commission carried out theirs. But there was a veritable industry of doing such studies. So this is with this is using, as I say, animal serum, generally horse serum, in the production of the antibody for antibody production. But later, and an interesting phenomenon was that this alternate allocation approach just remained in India for following this. And then phage studies were done, alternate allocation studies were done of phage when phage was introduced in the mid-1920s as something which might be useful in bacterial infection. And then a human convalescent serum was used. Now, so we might have seen, if you just treat 5 critically ill patients with COVID-19 with human convalescent plasma, of course you use plasma now because that's less antigenic. You get a paper in JAMA, and during the 2009 swine flu pandemic, these studies were done with convalescent plasma. This was the largest one. I've not been able to find any that were randomized or alternated. People don't do alternation now. So here you see what what's done in this study is you get 100 patients, or I can't remember how many it was. Anyway, they got a number of patients, and they compare the clinical outcome in the patients who declined the treatment with the control. So this is this is sort of evaluation. There's no attempt to deal with the bias that you'll get if you just have volunteers who take the treatment. But 80 years ago, 70 years ago, you wouldn't get away with that. And so here was the first paper I could find of using human serum therapy in plague in India, and that you've got your 48 treated with convalescent serum, 48 under routine hospital treatment. So, so that was the situation with where these alternate allocation trials definitely got well known through the plague, the treatment of plague, and through the fact that there was obviously huge political international interest in what was happening with the plague outbreak, whether it spread, etc., and the plague commissions to actually document, to document the therapeutic interventions. One of the people who was involved in some of these early serum treatment studies, so there's a treatment studies, was Waldemar Haffkine, who was much better known as someone who was developing vaccines. But he did carry out these antitoxic serum treatment. Here he talks about giving every second patient admitted during the hours they're at the hospital, irrespective of the information as to the serious or promising condition of the patient or the duration of the disease, without selecting patients according to our personal impressions or according to the statements supplied by the medical officer or by the patient or by the relatives who subjected the treatment to every second arrival. So he said, after 200 patients, outcomes weren't looking good, but that he considered this the only reliable method for finding, testing a curative treatment. So Haffkine, as I said, Haffkine, who had come from the Pasteur Institute, was more interested in carrying out vaccine studies. And here's one of his vaccine studies being reported by Bannerman again. So this is the attempt to immunize people and actually prevent them developing plague. And here you have 401 prisoners in a prison in Bombay, and it was resolved for the purposes of demonstration, one half of each group of prisoners would be operated on. As each group was brought forward, the individuals composing it were seated in rows, and every second man or woman was chosen for operation. 2 prisoners only refused to allow inoculation. So it's the degree to which these were volunteers is certainly debatable. But they were it was attempting to get some sort of fair notion of the effectiveness of the vaccine, and so such studies were carried out, with Haffkine saying the manner in which the half was selected guaranteed the elimination of all possible errors, usually inherent to observations on human communities. So emphasising the importance of that trial situation. And in some population studies as well, they were here they're vaccinating, inoculating half the men, half the women, half the children in each family. These are large. These would be large family, large households. And then Haffkine says, I've dwelt so long upon the description of the above experiments, not because they were the largest in volume or the most striking, which were made, but because they were the most precise of all, and so far as I'm aware, free from any possible loophole or mistake. So this was the best way of getting evidence. Haffkine had a view on publication bias. He said it would be easy to select the print materials which point to the definite result and to leave out the rest. The information published ought to be, however, above suspicion of any facts having been suppressed. All good, bad, complete, indefinite ought to be put before those who are interested in judging the question, and absolute freedom left to them for drawing conclusions pro and contra. So that everything had to be published. It would be just easy just to select the most favourable looking results. So, who was Waldemar Haffkine? He was a remarkable character. He was born in Odessa in Russia in 1860 of Jewish parents. Their name was then Haffkine. He changed his name later. He was in Odessa University, was active both with the Narodniks, so these are the sort of will of the people group. They could be seen as progenitors of the Bolsheviks. Certainly the Bolsheviks later saw the Narodniks as being somehow their progenitors, but just sort of slightly badly informed on the degree of organisation and deference to the Central Committee that was required. He was also a member of the Jewish Defence League, which was a very active and did what it said in the said on the tin. It would actually be out actively resisting the anti-Semitic activities, which were of course widespread in Russia at that time. So for his activities, he was imprisoned twice. He was expelled and kicked out of the university at one stage, eventually allowed back in. But he was lucky enough to have the support of Mechnikov, the developer of our notions, of some of our notions of immunology, of course cellular-based immunology rather than antibody-based immunology. And Mechnikov remained a supporter of Haffkine when Mechnikov went to join the Pasteur laboratory, where he was for decades, where Mechnikov was for decades. Haffkine refused to convert to Russian Orthodox Church, wasn't therefore allowed to have a teaching post. He did get a post as assistant at the Odessa Zoology Museum, but with the increasing repression, he left for Geneva in 1889 and then joined Mechnikov at the Pasteur Institute. He was a librarian and a bottle glassware washer, but eventually managed to develop his scientific interests, which were already strong in the Pasteur Institute. And in 1892, after Robert Koch had identified the bacteria for cholera in Calcutta in 1883, and Jaime Ferrer had attempted inoculations in Spain in 1885, but Haffkine developed a cholera vaccine in the Pasteur laboratories and tested it on himself and then on friends before utilizing it, attempting to utilize it on others. But he's unable to test the vaccine in Russia or Germany or France or Spain, either through politically not being allowed to do so or because there wasn't enough cholera. In 1893, he managed to negotiate moving to India and carrying out some studies in India through Lord Dufferin, who had been a former Governor General of India and was an ambassador in Paris. And apparently Haffkine sort of managed to find him at some social event and talk to him and get permission to go. Haffkine's, it's difficult to, one of the difficulties with Haffkine's biography is there's two biographies available. One is the story of Dr. Haffkine, which was published in the Soviet Union, and it's extremely difficult to get hold of, but it's very old. But it has this rather sweet thing at the back that Progress Publishers would be glad to have your opinions of this book in translation and design, and any suggestions you may have for future publications. Send your letter to 2021 Zybowski Boulevard, Moscow, USSR. But these were these were books that were made for sale in the outside of the Soviet Union and were probably considered to be maybe more attractive than copies of Lenin's What Is to Be Done in terms of the potential sales. But that has a very particular. That one has a very particular take on Haffkine's huge involvement in the proto-revolutionary forces in Russia, and then the other. Popovsky changed his view on the how great the Soviet Union was, and wrote one of the early books on Vavilov, the geneticist who opposed Lysenko and was starved in a camp in one of the gulags. Anyway, the other biography of Haffkine is by the Nobel Prize winner Selman Waksman, who won his Nobel Prize for helping develop antibiotics, including streptomycin. But that one focuses rather little on very little on the Narodnik days, and rather more on Haffkine's later life when he wrote much on like a plea for orthodoxy within Judaism, for example. So you get very different pictures of Haffkine in what you read, but he certainly was a fascinating character. So Lord John Kimberley, who was Secretary of State for India, met Haffkine in London and gave him the facilities to visit every part of India to test the value of his anti-cholera vaccine. So he went not to test anything to do with that plague outbreak hadn't occurred. But he was told that all inoculations were to be voluntary. So this was a contemporary thing. This was 1894. W.J. Simpson, who was a major figure in military medicine, well, just medicine, but writing about this. So everything had to be voluntary. And here is the introduction of the anti-cholera inoculations in Calcutta. This is in March 1894, and you've got W.J. Simpson is there, and Haffkine as these inoculations are being carried out. And there's lots of the Wellcome collection has lots of lovely photos of cholera vaccination inoculations being carried out. And the first place where it's very, very clearly carried out as an alternate study was another prison study. So a lot of these investigations were done in places where some were done amongst the military, and prisons were popular places where you have a captive. I suppose in prisons you literally have a captive audience. So, this is a report in the Indian Medical Gazette written by another Indian Medical Service officer, Surgeon Captain E. Harold Brown. And E. Harold Brown has two publications. There's this one, and then there's one about 20 years earlier on some rather unpleasant sounding surgical procedure. It didn't seem to have a great background for having developed a novel approach to evaluating therapy. But in this he says that Haffkine and Green arrived at the camp and proceeded to make arrangements to inoculate such as were willing to submit to the operation. The prisoners were spoken to on the subject and seemed to be pleased with the idea. So remember that this all had to be voluntary. The word tika, which was familiar to them from its association with smallpox inoculation, appearing to appeal to them. They were accordingly arranged, sitting in 4 rows facing the tent in front of which Haffkine was about to commence operations. I was the first subject to be inoculated. So whether that actually was like he was actually in the alternate order, but anyway. And after me, the jailer, assistant jailer, hospital assistant. And then the first prisoner submitted cheerfully, after which every alternate man was taken. No selection of cases was made until 1/2 of the total number were inoculated. And it turned out that those who had not been inoculated weren't happy about being passed over, and rose almost to a man and begged to be inoculated. But they were told the medicine was exhausted. This clearly demonstrates the fact that, so far from compulsion being practiced or being necessary, inoculation was sought voluntarily, and prisoners who were passed by considered they were badly treated. Before him, in 1894, a study, but where it was written in a way it was possible to know how these people was chosen who was given treatment. Another jail study. This was in the Gaia jail by Surgeon Major R. McCrae, and again, not a man with extensive publication record. McCrae wrote about a similar situation, and says about how within the four walls of the jail there's no loophole for doubt. The conditions of inoculated and not inoculated were absolutely identical, and that there is further the great advantage that it was possible to check the results obtained with absolute accuracy. But it just turned out that 215 out of 433 were inoculated, so it's probably rather likely that this was being done in the same way. And it said no difference of any kind was made between inoculated and non-inoculated. They were under absolutely identical conditions, etc. Here's McCrae featuring in the Celtic Monthly in the traditional garb, and it turned out that he had a commanding and soldierly presence, and he looked really good in Highland costume. British Army would be proud of him. Now, it's the case that Haffkine was basically prohibited by the government of India from publishing his research early on, and that he then, and it has been found that his original research has often appeared under the name or names of the British officers of the Indian Medical Service, through whose channels Haffkine's reports had to pass. So that's probably how McCrae and Brown got their publications. This is, Haffkine later writing about this process, about how he, basically inoculated himself and then a number of his friends, and then he went out to inoculate, enormous numbers of large numbers of people where there were outbreaks, of course. And so this would be responsive to evidence of a cholera outbreak. We had to be ready to move when the outbreaks occurred. But he said his efforts were directed to inoculating people under such conditions as would afterwards render possible an accurate study of results, which included the attempts that were made, these attempts made at alternation. And here he is with inoculating Bengali school kids. And then referring to one of the prison studies, he says, few operations which are made within the walls of a laboratory exceeded in precision the one just described. So he's then comparing this, because he was of course a laboratory scientist in the Pasteur Institute when developing vaccines, and so that the results of these prison studies were sort of controlled, better as controlled as those from the lab, and he accepted these conclusions confidently as a guidance for my future work. And of course, in the Pasteurian, in the legend, then there is the Bois-le-Voir episode when Pasteur carried out a public demonstration of the success of his anthrax vaccine, and in this there was a sort of wager was made, and the public turned out to witness this whole occasion, and the sheep, largely sheep, but then there's a few cows and there's 2 goats, were divided into a group, half given the anthrax the vaccine, half not, and then later in front of crowds of people, they were then tested with live anthrax to see which died, and of course the vaccinated animals did very well. So here, so this laboratory control that Haffkine is talking about, there was this, you know, it was staged in this grand way by Pasteur as a public relations, a very enormously successful public relations act. He was very good at such things. But for lab scientists, you'd leave half your mice uninjected and or whatever for doing these studies very clearly and described. But it wasn't thought there. It was thought that that there would be similar, but here, at least in this case, at least as it was stated, it was carried out in this way. So the controls, so this the sort of approach would seem to have sort of moved out from the lab to both public demonstrations with animals like Pasteur was, like Poilefour, and then the alternate allocation studies that basically Haffkine, through Haffkine, were introduced in India through the cholera situation, and then probably because of the, in some ways, chance occurrence of arrival of plague while Haffkine was there. Haffkine then stayed in India, and there's now still the Haffkine Institute. It's a famous institute in India, which was then set up during the plague outbreak to make both these therapeutic serums, but then vaccines. If you like the Pasteur story, it's rather than his account, you should read Gerald Geeson's just an extraordinary book, The Private Science of Louis Pasteur. If you're a Pasteur enthusiast, don't read it. But the Poilefour events was a dire fix. Before the public demonstration, Pasteur had, I think it was, I can't think it was Roux, went along sort of secretly and got 4 of the sheep, 2 vaccinated and 2 not, and gave them the anthrax. And so Pasteur himself only turned up once he knew that it wasn't going to be a disaster. And anyway, the whole story is it's a fantastic read about the actual realities against what can be presented. And Pasteur was basically the first sort of scientist, one of the first scientists to understand how to present oneself in public and get support, I'm sure, for science. Of course, the use of humans in studies of disease goes back a huge amount of time. I mean, indeed, I mean, here's Cunningham was another member of the medical service, saying we could head sweeper for a few rupee with the, swallow, would take a cholera ejector. I mean, of course, many people did this like to try and demonstrate that, that cholera wasn't contagious. Example of which there's a brilliant fictional, Indian-based fictional story in Siege of Krishnapur by J.G. Farrell, which is a brilliant book if you've not read it. Haffkine, some lots of stamps in India, and there's quite a lot of Eastern European countries, and in Israel. But why is he largely forgotten? So one is that he was restricted by the permissions he was given from advertising fully the experimental nature of his studies, because his permission was that everything had to be voluntary, and so it was somewhat hidden until it became less hidden as the years went on. But initially, so, and then the Mulkawal disaster, known as the Little Dreyfus Affair, given its very obvious parallels through the anti-Semitism of the Dreyfus Affair, was that in one part of India where inoculations were carried out, contaminated contaminated material was given, and I think 19 people died, and there was a massive outcry, and the Indian Medical Service person in charge sort of managed to escape sanction, and Haffkine was blamed as though this was something in the production of the material, although the story was that the bung had been dropped on the ground, etc. Anyway, he was scapegoated during that. Eventually, with people like Ronald Ross, the malaria fame, and many others rallying round, there was one of the first sort of a campaign to have Haffkine reinstated, and Haffkine to be made clear that he was not responsible for this tragedy. But when he was allowed to return to work in India, he was not allowed to do field trials. The permission was then that he couldn't do such studies, and definitely the fact that the vaccines had sort of disputed or relatively small effects, and within the medical world, and Haffkine's links were most strongly with the UK medical scene, for the fact that Almouth writes very considerable hostility to Haffkine was definitely a reason. So, Wright's view, as many people who opposed evidence-based medicine, was that while it may be permissible to rank all men as equally competent observers of respective things that admit of being measured by Carpenter's rules or are being weighed upon gross balances, and to rank as the most authoritative on these matters the man who reports the largest number of observations, this doctrine cannot find application in medicine, for here in many cases truth can be arrived at only by exceptional skill and very delicate calculation of probabilities. And Almouth Wright was, of course, the person who had that exceptional skill, and indeed smart enough to carry out the delicate calculation of probabilities. So that opposition to these sort of approaches, which had to admit that there was equipoise, so that the doctor, the treating person, would have to explicitly put forward the notion that you didn't know whether the treatment was going to work or not to justify doing such studies, wasn't something which, when you were in Harley Street charging people in a lot of guineas to see you, that you would want to admit. So I'm going to finish with the quiz, but it doesn't really work very well. It doesn't work very well in the virtual seminar mode, but I think there's some way on chat people can post their answers to as the first answer to it. So here, the question is this combined, this really complex, really beautifully complex design of a combined plague prophylaxis and treatment trial. So who knows the brilliant scientist who was behind this? So this followed on, and in the discussion of this, in the text around it, it mentions the India studies. So you've got a whole population. And this whole population is split by alternation. It's very clear it's by alternation to the treated 50%, untreated 50%, and then thinking that this is with the inoculation, and then it's thought that the treated 50%, if it works, you'll get rather few cases, but amongst the untreated 50%, you then get the plague cases, And then for the serum therapy, you then alternate the serum therapy. So you've got this, so it's, you know, it's complicated, complicated design. It's rather actually like the prostate cancer study that, you know, Jenny Donovan set up, and Richard Martin helped with the where you randomized, you know, there was some sort of randomization to actually screening or not for prostate cancer, and then amongst those who've got prostate cancer, you randomized. They were randomized to 3 different treatments. So there you go. So there you go, brilliant thing. And so you divided the population in 2 equal parts. One half was injected with plague phage. Sorry, it was phage. Sorry, it wasn't antiserum. It was phage, not, which is, you know, it's viruses, but they attack the bacteria. The other half was left without, and there were these phage alternate studies were done in India. Among the initially untreated plague cases treated, given the phage to alternate patients. So there you go. Well, and the person got a Nobel Prize for this. So the designer of that trial was Sinclair Lewis in his novel Arrowsmith, written in 1924. And he says he saw far off India with its annual 400,000 deaths from plague saved by his efforts. So there you go. So Nobel Prize winning novelist was actually even putting this into his novels. It's a brilliant Ronald Colman film. If you can't get through Sinclair Lewis's turgid prose. Of course, Sinclair Lewis now is better known for It Can't Happen Here because of Trump getting elected. Of course, lots of people are reading his book about fascist takeover in the US. There's one Coleman. So, as I say, these studies just went on and on. Here's a serum therapy of plague, Lancet 1931. The studies just carried on and on, these alternate studies before basically being replaced by randomization. So just reflecting on alternation. So first, it's consistent with laboratory practice and around the prevention and treatment of infectious disease. So the people who came out in the infectious disease world, people have often been lab scientists, then moving from the lab development of vaccines, etc., to treatments, or the lab developments of anti-sera. That this is what they were basically. Doing in their laboratory work, and it wasn't introduced at all due to statistical theory. Alternation was not introduced on the basis of statistical theory. Randomization, as introduced by Fisher, in the ways that Fisher writes about it when he's introducing it, it's not about balancing confounders, even though people write, R.A. Fisher introduced randomization to balance confounders, etc. all the time. It was actually, because he's a statistician, so he was sort of interested in these things. It was actually to make the statistical tests actually valid as qua-statistical tests, in that the randomization would ensure similarity of variances, etc. So that was statistical theory played a role there, and Fisher's opposition of the sort of half drill approach, which others were doing, which way you went up, in the agricultural experiment, you would go up a field with a sower that would only sow from one half, and then you would turn around the other way, etc. And replacing that with randomization appears to be due to, for statistical reasons. But so alternation wasn't through any form of statistical theory. It was just that you have some basic notion of what is a fair comparison. It's only fair to compare, the two halves that are comparable. And if it's strictly adhered to, it's unbiased as randomization. But it can be subverted, because the problem is that if the doctor knows who's coming up, or the treating person knows who's coming up next, you can find ways of subverting it. And it's possibly forgotten because the large majority of studies were not successful. And so, for example, the common cold trial by the MRC just before the streptomycin study, sort of the last big alternate allocation trial was the Patchelin trial. So those are probably the reasons. That's it. And thanks to to people who helped. And it's really, really weird doing a seminar to a computer. But at least you could turn me off, as I say. But I think Lindsay maybe could say something and tell us how we can actually, if we could do any questions, if anyone has any, what to do.
Of course. If anybody has any questions, they can type it in the chat box. If George has got his chat box open, he'll be able to see that. And also, if people want to raise their hand and ask a question, I can unmute you from my controls. So just raise your hand, and I'll look out for that.
Can't find my chat box. No, I'll stop sharing my screen, shall I? No. Oh.
Okay, George, while you're looking for your chat box, we've got one question.
Okay.
Have you found them?
No.
Okay, so here's a question. Do you think there are impacts of class and race for the studies being valued?
Yeah, no, absolutely. The issue was you had an imperialist power who were governing India, governing the parts of India were under direct rule and incorporation in the British Empire, and therefore we're doing. It became part of the sort of managerial logic of imperialism. Was that such investigations could be carried out, or were carried out, including in jails, etc. I mean, the other, the other side of that is that Haffkine was definitely someone who also suffered very seriously in his life, from anti-Semitism himself, and then was the investigator who was carrying out these things. I mean, he wasn't he wasn't part of the governing elite. He wasn't British. He wasn't in the Indian medical service, and was almost sort of initially allowed on sufferance. So those issues are definitely there. I think one of the issues about class, which is drawn up, which is I think thrown into light, is thrown into light with epidemics, is that epidemics, are often seen to be infectious diseases are often seen to be sort of bad luck. And don't respect the usual boundaries of geography or class. And that was certainly the case of the cholera outbreaks in Britain, around the middle of the 19th century, where if you look at the cholera maps in Bristol from 1832 from William Byrd, and then you look at what John Snow's work, that the well-off were dying of cholera. There'd be very public cases of that being seen, and whether or not retrospectively you go back, it might well have been a disease which did, to an extent, affect the poor a bit more, but it wasn't not to the same extent as other illnesses at that time. So it was so such epidemics, actually then led to the state doing something to improve the situation, because because the controlling classes were also being threatened by the disease, and we have this rather bizarre sort of illustration of that now. But I think that could be one way in which one could conceptualize the current situation, which is where we've had several years of evidence of mortality rates stopped going down and even started going up, and amongst the older population didn't seem to be due to seasonal influenza. Danny Dorling and then Michael Marmot and others, then drew attention to these sort of adverse consequences of austerity measures. Nothing's done about it. It's unlikely that my prediction, very dangerous thing to predict, but I think it'd be unlikely that the total mortality will be higher this year than in a few years, in one of the bad austerity years in the last few years, and that nothing's done about deaths due to austerity, but something which appears to be, it looks like it's an equal opportunity disease. Things are done.
I think I have a couple more questions. So one of our respected colleagues would like to know your opinion on when all the COVID stuff is going to be over.
No idea. You mean the actual disease, or the forms of lockdown? I say the government was much less effective at getting them in place, and there was a lot more resistance in Bombay.
Do you want to move on? There's one further question. Alternate allocation is probably absolutely fine for these large vaccine trials, right? Many systematic reviews exclude them or downrate them for risk of bias, but actually there's no real reason to believe alternate allocation causes substantive bias in vaccine trials.
So I think that would be the case if you had evidence that the alternation couldn't be subverted. So I think the sort of distrust of them is that the physician, the treating person, might try and subvert the alternate allocation, which might be harder than to subvert randomization. And in that it's interesting. With Choksi, definitely thought some of the people shouldn't have been included in the trial. But I think if alternation is done strictly, then and really is done strictly, then there's no reason to think that it should actually produce groups which differ in systematic ways more than they would in randomization. You have to judge like with like. It's more difficult to blind an alternate allocation study, but you can do so, of course. So you can blind alternate allocation studies.
Okay. Any other questions?
Well, thanks for lasting that long. Those who did last that long, thank you.
So one further comment here. Thank you, but the problem is there is no way to validate that it is done strictly.
Yeah. So that can be a problem. Yeah. I mean, there are situations where you can do it. There are situations where you can validate it. You do it by number. So so people you do it by insurance number, odd and even. Then you can validate it. Then you can show that your national insurance number, is it odd or even? You get treated if it's odd, you don't if it's even, or you take a tablet and you don't know whether it's active ingredient or not, depending on whether it's odd and even. So you can validate it. If you can think of ways in which you can do it, then it's just as valid that you can validate it just as well as you can randomization.
Okay. Any other questions? Well, here's another one. Thank you. A great history lesson, and why it's important to have community as part of the committees to review protocol and show where problems may arise.
Yeah, definitely, absolutely, definitely.
Okay, last chance to ask any questions.
Well, people have done amazingly well staying until 12 minutes past 5. I'm very impressed.
Thank you.
Great. Oh, ethics of convalescent.
Yeah, so there's one late entry there. Ethics if conducting vaccine trials in countries of high incidence rather than where it's easier to do. Do you think regulatory control?
Yeah, that's a very important. It's a very important point. I mean, you know, for Haffkine, he had a cholera vaccine, and he had to be somewhere where there was cholera. So, you couldn't go out to a place where there might not be. It's likely not to be any outbreaks, or might not be any outbreaks, etc. The ethical issue that particularly comes in, I think, in those situations is when it's thought that those studies have actually been done to get evidence that can then be used in the rich country, in the sponsoring country. So it's so it's literally being used as a sort of test bed or test case for something that the people from the wealthy countries want to know. So that's definitely an issue of very obvious ethical violation.
Okay, so we're getting lots of thanks now from the
That's
panel.
very kind. Great. Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Yep, and I can see that people are starting to leave now, so I think we've come to a natural end.
So we'll have to see whether it was so bad that we don't do any more, or we might do some more remote seminars, I guess. Lindsay, you'll be in touch with people who are on this, I guess.
Yeah.
If we have more seminars, yeah.
We're going to have more seminars, so we'd like some suggestions and volunteers.
Right, brilliant, great. Thanks very much. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you all.
Bye. Oh, not that I know how to actually leave. Oh yeah, leave meeting.
You can leave the meeting.